Hello, students of history. I'm Frank. I am a history expert with a degree in history, and I'm here in the Gothic bedroom to share my expertise on all things sort of history and antiques based, with a special focus on World War One for the time being. And I'd like to give a special thanks to the McGovern Collection for loaning me the artifact or artifacts we're going to discuss today. You could say that I rely on the founder and trustee of that collection for this show that I'm doing, and there's nothing about that I resent. I'm 100% into it. I don't mind that at all. Anyway, today I'm going to be teaching everybody a little bit about Canadians in World War One. So historically, everybody might know the Canadians have been stereotyped a little bit as polite, good-natured, maybe a little bit provincial, and generally harmless. Maybe they've been teased because of that reputation. Experts in history like myself, we wouldn't engage in that sort of juvenile, unprofessional, cultural, or ethnic teasing. That's not really what we do, but it happened. And the world had always assumed that the Canadians were going to take this ribbing with sort of good humor. You know, humor spelled with a U, sort of thing history experts know about. And everybody assumed it just didn't bother them. You know, they just rolled off their backs. So that brings us to the year 1915. So on the transport ships over to Europe, the Canadian troops were as anxious and frightened as soldiers of any nationality. You know, they were like, oh, gee, I sure hope that we get back to, Regina, Saskatchewan after this war. I hope we get out of this thing alive. And not just because I have a degree in history, but also because I have relatives around the area. They pronounce it. It's pronounced Regina, Saskatchewan. There's nothing funny about it. It's just the way they pronounce the word. So anyway, but they would have been as frightened as anybody. And at some point, they leave the ship and they're marching across the toward the front, right? Marching toward Belgium, toward the front line. They were going to Ypres, which was one of the main battles of World War One. They broke it up into battles, but Ypres was basically, it was a place where the battle just sort of never stopped from, the beginning of the war, almost the beginning of the war to the end. The Ypres salient, anyway, was a place that fighting was pretty much always happening. So the Canadians, they would have been frightened marching there as well. But then everything changed. They got close enough to a German trench that they could hear each other. And one of the German soldiers decided he was going to demoralize the Canadians. And he called out, this has been recorded by a number of other history experts. If you look up the work of Tyler Garrison and others, you're going to find this information. But one of the German soldiers looks out of the trench and he says, hey, Canadians, the hockey team by the name of Toronto Maple Leafs is made out of bitch. And then it happened. The Canadian soldiers changed. All of those years of appeasement and deference and politeness and the jabs and teasing and all of that, the frustration of the entire country that had been repressed endlessly, it crystallized into this sort of rage and resolve, but against Germany. The soldiers' postures changed. Any hint of fear or apprehension sort of vanished. Their jaws set. Their eyes had the steely resolve. They stood up straighter. And not just soldiers who were there. It was reported among all the Canadian soldiers, even back in Canada. Somebody there reported, a history expert there reported that someone in Canada swore for the first time at this moment, and they didn't know why until later. But so there was this energy that you could see unleashed from the Canadians. This sort of collective unconscious among the Canadian people. This wave of it just releasing into this rage, and so all of that energy, you could see it like I said, this wave moving through the soldiers. But the power of it meant it lashed back at the soldier who'd said this. But because he was a coward, he turned his head like that, which is lucky, because if he hadn't, this energy wave would have knocked his eyes out. But as it was, it just temporarily blinded him. And that soldier's name, who changed the Canadians into what they would become, his name was Adolf Hitler. If you maybe don't believe me, you can look it up. I have a degree in history, so just look it up, see if Adolf Hitler was a soldier in World War I and whether or not he went temporarily blind. And then you can stop looking then, and when you see whether or not that's the case, then you can ask yourself why you would make choices like questioning the word of a history expert when he tells you something about World War One. Anyway, so he changed the Canadians for good. So they show up in the front lines in Belgium, in Ypres, with this sort of thirst for vengeance that could only be slaked by a whole lot of German blood. And that confrontation would become it would become famous as the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. So a little bit of background for this. Shortly before the main Canadian force got there, the Germans had used gas for the first time on the French and some Canadians who were stationed there. And it was horrifying. I mean, it was a truly horrific attack. They used chlorine gas. Mustard gas was not in use yet. And the chlorine was so caustic, it would burn eyes out. I mean, it would blind people permanently. And if you were lucky, you asphyxiated on this horrible caustic poison gas. And if you weren't lucky, you died over a period of time from the damage done to your lungs by this gas. And if you wanted to get out of there, I mean, the people who managed to get out of managed to run up over the top or whatever to get away from the gas were often just cut down by German machine guns. So that was the thing they were walking into. I mean, this new terrifying form of attack that nobody was prepared for. I mean, nobody had gas masks yet. It was, this was this new horrific, it was modern war that no one was ready for. And it would have been terrifying. So when the Canadians got there, the French, would have been like, the Germans had attacked again with gas. So the French would have been like, no, you cannot attack today. It is, the Germans have used the gas again. It can't happen. And the Canadians were like, that's not gonna work, bud. This is an Old Testament biblical reckoning type of deal here, eh? We're going over the top. Vengeance is nigh, eh? So some Canadian expert in chemistry and probably history discovered that urine could act as like a gas filtration agent. This is 100% true. You can look this up. I have a degree in history, so I know. But the Canadians seriously found that if you pissed into a rag, like their handkerchief or whatever sort of cloth they had around, piss into that thing, and then strap it over your mouth and nose, and then strap on goggles, right? So you had this ad hoc respirator that you could make it through the gas, long enough so that you could go and kill the Germans you needed to kill for insulting your hockey team. And so I mean, imagine being a German soldier in World War I, and you're probably joking with your buddies that it's like, oh, we're just fighting the Canadians, how quaint. If we were a division of moose, that might be scary, but we're not. And then you see these guys, these Canadian hardasses, charging out of your cloud of poison gas with piss masks strapped to their face and goggles on, bayonets fixed, just going for shit, right? And when the Canadians, being Canadians and being changed by what Hitler said, they hadn't even bothered to do reconnaissance. They just charged up over the top. And when they got within a couple hundred yards, they ran into these hedges that were like laced with barbed wire, so they beat through that with their rifle butts. And this is while the Germans were opening up on them with machine guns. But they did it. They beat their way through. And then, they got to the trenches and started fighting, the Germans. And the Germans are like, oh, mein Gott, look what he does to Hans. I surrender. And the Canadians were having none of that. They're so sorry, bud. It's far too late for that, eh? And the Canadians got to work. They were like, and then, oh, what? Shing. And then, so you're probably thinking that the last thing that happened there was a Canadian ripped a guy's heart out and took a bite while it was still beating, but that's not what happened. It was a different body part, and it wasn't beating, it was puckering, open and closed. So think about that for a sec, figure out what that's about. Best not to think about. So anyway, these Canadians were so committed to getting the Germans and punishing them for what they'd said that they suffered 75% casualties in this battle, in the Battle of Kitchener's Wood. That means 3 out of 4 Canadians were either killed or wounded, but they won. They beat the hell out of the Germans, as they were wont to do. And the supreme commander of all the Allied forces, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, called it the greatest act of war, or the greatest act of the war, rather. So that's the most amazing thing done by any army on any side during all of World War I, was what the Canadians managed to do at any, or it is what the Canadians managed to do at Kitchener's Wood. And that's pretty much set the tone for Canadians in World War One, and honestly World War II as well. The Germans and all the Central Powers were terrified of the Canadians because they were absolute beasts. Like, in addition to just being, just total units in the trenches, just sort of kicking ass. They are the deadliest sniper, for instance, of any army on any side during World War One was a Canadian. He was this badass, this First Nations badass called Francis Pega-Magabo. And Pega-Magabo. Yep. And he had over 300 kills, and he was crazy as hell. Like he was just, he sort of encapsulated what Canada was in World War One. Like he would, in addition to all the other insane shit he did, he would sneak over and just kind of hang out in the German trenches sometimes, or he'd sneak over when they were sleeping, and he would cut a piece off a German uniform and swarm back to his line to show people. Like, he thought he was sort of blessed. And I guess he was. He got wounded a couple times. But, he managed to kill 300 dudes and cut pieces of clothing off German, uniforms or whatever and survive it. So, anyway. So they in kind of all wars, since then, like, as much as people joke about the Canadians, they do not play in war. The Canadians are not messing around. And so this here's the main part of this. So this is it's a Ross Bayonet, a 1905 Ross Bayonet. It's Canadian, and this is pretty sort of representative of what the Canadians were about. See here. So one sec. So this is we've seen this before in another video, but this is a French Yatagan bayonet, right? And so it's a real stylish thing. Again, it's like a short sword. It's got this sort of like chic curve in it. It's nice, it's pretty, but it's impractical as hell in the trenches, but not so with the Ross Bayonet. This thing is all business. And if you notice, like, it does not have, this is not the way they were originally made. Originally, if you'll notice, there's this sort of like slant here at the end where this kind of goes into it has this, sort of slants down more sharply there at the end. Originally, they would have had a more traditional style blade, but the Canadians ground this thing down because this shape, when ground down, would more efficiently enter the bodies of Germans and get them. So that's what they were about. And so that's about it. So the next time you consider teasing Canadians about anything, you should maybe think twice about it, because that rage is just being stored up, and it can be unleashed sort of at any time. And so that's about it. I'd welcome you to subscribe or like or do whatever. If you prefer not to, that's fine. Some people don't like to learn. But this is, it's a history lesson from someone with a degree in the subject and not a popularity contest. So you do what you want. So thank you for your time, and I will talk to you next time.